Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Turner Roth. This is a New York Young Communist League educational on William Z. Foster's text, American Trade Unionism, Principles, Organization, Strategy, Tactics. Friends and comrades, there can be no doubt that as of this moment in the year 2022, we are in the midst of a resurgence of interest in the writings of William Z. Foster. This, of course, does not come from nowhere, despite decades of decline in union density such that today little over 11% of the workforce belongs to a union. We are experiencing, as of today, great stirrings within the long repressed workers of this country who are organizing fightbacks and revitalizing the labor movement with new experiments in workshop democracy. The incredible victory of the Amazon labor union in Staten Island over this titan of union-busting commerce signals the beginning of a new chapter, we hope, in organized labor. So too does the expanding movement of unionization at Starbucks, which has relentlessly fought the overwhelmingly successful campaign to establish an independent union. Prior to these recent trends in labor, the established unions have as well come alive and waged many successful strikes against such private employers recently as John Deere, Kroger, Columbia University, Nabisco, and many others, reaching a high point in the number of strikes and lockouts over many decades. The past few years have, of course, been shaped by a global pandemic that has exposed not only the fragility of our systems, but the ruthlessness with which the capitalist economy exploits the so-called essential worker, a figure at once mythologized and brutalized by the same system. The pandemic has intensified what is an ongoing crisis in the capitalist world order, which had hardly recovered from its 2008 breakdown by the time the pandemic hit us. Be all this as it may, the question still remains, why Foster and why now? What does this Labor and Communist Party leader, whose main activity took place nearly a century ago, have to teach us about the present? As many are now finding out, the answer is a lot, insofar as many of the issues Foster faced are still with us, and his solutions to those problems are no less aged, but still capture the essence of what successful organizing looks like. The selected writings we will be looking at here, selected by Foster himself and first printed by international publishers in 1947, represent nearly a half-century of writings that express the practical and theoretical struggles Foster was engaged in. These essays thus form the central thinking and experiences of one of the greatest labor organizers in United States history, who a new generation are now learning about and recognizing as such. That Foster was a communist is also significant with respect to where the political winds currently blow in this country, whose young people are increasingly aware of the limitations of the established political order. My task here will thus be to present the central concepts of these writings in such a way that their systematic interrelations and clarity are apparent to someone who has not yet read this work or who has only read a little. In this way, a solid foundation in the principles, organizational tactics, and strategy that Foster distilled can be taken up by those engaged in union organizing or who wish to broaden their theoretical and historical grasp of US labor history. Let us then begin at the beginning and sketch a brief overview of Foster's life before entering into the materials of the text. (1881), born in Taunton, Massachusetts, near Boston, February 25th, 1881. Attends school from ages 7 to 10, selling newspapers throughout. Leaves school at age 10 due to family poverty, begins work as an assistant to a sculptor, then at a type foundry. 1894, first strike Foster participates in was that of the Philadelphia Street Carmen in 1894, heyday of the Knights of Labor and of the foundation of the American Federation of Labor. In midst of great industrial crisis, American Railway Union stages a great strike led by Eugene V. Debs, which is crushed by the federal government and AFL treachery. In the West, the Western Federation of Miners, with William Haywood in leadership, wages large strikes that turn into armed conflicts between miners and the company thugs and federal government. 1900. joins First Union, the streetcarmen in New York City, subsequently fired for union organizing efforts. Debs's first run for president on the Socialist Party ticket. Foster becomes a member of the Socialist Party. In 1901 to 1904, illness due to exposure to lead in fertilizers as a child worker, leaves for the West, boards the Pegasus, a British four-masted bark, 3 years as a deep water sailor, sailing 1.5 times around the world. Arrives back in Oregon in 1904 in time to cast a vote for Debs. 1904 to 1907, takes more of an active part in the Socialist Party as part of its militant left wing, works in various industries, applies to join the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen and Engineers, but the industrial crisis of 1907 leads to layoff. 1907 to 1909, works as a building laborer and in the local sawmills in Seattle. Socialist Party splits following the state convention in Everett, Washington. Decides not to join Daniel De Leon's Socialist Labor Party due to its dogmatic utopianism. 1910, former Socialist Party left wing launches a new party, the Wage Workers' Party. Collapses almost immediately. Foster jailed in Spokane for involvement with the International Workers of the World. Joins the IWW while imprisoned. Impressed with the success of the syndicalist organization Confédération Générale du Travail, travels to Paris and stays 6 months studying the labor movement. Travels to Germany, also staying for 6 months. (1911) Convention of the IWW in Chicago, where Foster campaigns in favor of working within the conservative trade unions. 1912, strike wave kicked off by the great IWW-led Lawrence strike of 23,000 textile workers. IWW reaches peak of its influence. Dual unionism spreads throughout the left wing. Foster leaves the IWW to join the AFL Brotherhood of Railway Carmen of America in Chicago. Syndicalist League of North America is born from the former IWW members, which lasts 2 years. AFL, IWW, and the Socialist Party all see upsurge in membership. 1914, Foster co-founds the International Trade Union Educational League in Chicago. World War I begins. 1915 to 1916, the International Trade Union Educational League, penetration of the Chicago Federation of Labor, pushes the CFL to become one of the most progressive labor councils in the US at the time. (1917), CFL adopts proposal put forward by Foster to organize the packing industry, formation of the Stockyards Labor Council with 12 local unions, initial difficulties in integrating Black workers into the majority white unions. Gompers and the AFL, along with President Wilson and the federal government, collaborate to impede planned national strikes, pushing mediation. Arbitration proceedings result in a general win for the packing house workers. In the end, more than 200,000 workers came into the 12 federated unions, including unskilled workers, immigrants, and Black workers. Stockyard Labor Council soon afterward thwarted with assistance from AFL leaders through the establishment of 2 other trades councils, effectively breaking up the industrial union into smaller craft unions. (1918), Foster introduces a resolution into the CFL signed by 12 other metal trades unions calling for a nationwide AFL campaign of all unions having jurisdiction over workers in the steel industry. At the Chicago conference, Foster puts forward a 6-week plan of federating the steel unions and establishing national leadership. Gompers and AFL leadership immediately try to sabotage the campaign. Campaign also faces fierce resistance from the company unions, which enlist hired thugs, Ku Klux Klan, and others to unleash violence. Despite internal and external sabotage, organizing campaign is successful. and in the course of 14 months, the main plants in the steel districts are organized. 1919, Great Steel Strike. 350,000 workers in 10 states participate. Demands include the reinstatement of those fired for union activities, establishment of 8-hour day, 1 day of rest per week, double rates for overtime, abolition of company unions. Strike faces bitter and violent resistance. 22 killed, hundreds injured, thousands arrested. Strike is defeated after 3 months, and the workers' new unions are smashed. Foster resigns his position as a Brotherhood of Railway Carmen organizer. (1920) Foster, Jack Johnstone, Joe Manley, and other Chicago militants launched the Trade Union Educational League, which would advocate for and organize militant left-wing takeovers of the old trade unions. Dual unionist tendencies still strong in this moment. 1921 to 1925, growth of the Trade Union Educational League, drive for amalgamation, for a labor party, and for recognition of Soviet Russia. Communist Party plays a leading role in the Tool movement. Subsequent repression and expulsion of Tool and CP members from the AFL unions. Earl Browder invites Foster to attend a conference of the Profintern, the Red International of Labor Unions, in Moscow in 1921. Foster joins the CPUSA upon his return to the United States. Tool affiliates with the Profintern in 1923. 1926. Tool, one of the only militant labor movements organizing strikes at this time. Tool helps organize New Jersey textile workers strike in 1926. First mass strike in US history led independently by communists. 1926 strike of New York furriers, led by Tool, emerges victorious. 1926 also saw the New York cloak makers strike, which was effectively sabotaged by the collaborationist union leadership and defeated. 1928 to 1929. With the AFL in severe decline, Tool helped set up independent unions in mining, textile, and needles trade. Tool reorganized and renamed the Trade Union Unity League at its national convention in 1929. Tool pursues independent unionism, but opposed dual unionism. The Coolidge period of prosperity fails to bring in more workers to the labor movement. On the contrary, the AFL unions lost members due to the various anti-worker policies of class collaboration. As a result, by the end of the 1920s, the Socialist Party nearly ceases to exist. The Farmer Labor Party movement has dwindled, and the IWW and other independent unions decline heavily. Great Depression begins in October 1929. Foster made General Secretary of the CPUSA. 1930, runs for governor of New York on the Communist Party ticket, actively involved in Tool. 1932, Foster suffers a severe heart attack during a speaking tour as Communist Party presidential candidate. Bedridden for many months and unable to work for the next 3 years. 1933 to 35. The early New Deal period sees a strike wave among the most militant and effective in US history. 1936 to 1939. Foster returns to politics and to labor organizing. 1939 to 45, World War II. CPUSA aids in the war effort against fascism. 1945, Earl Browder expelled from the Communist Party. Foster assumes leadership along with Eugene Dennis and John Williamson. 1948, campaigns for Henry Wallace and his Progressive Party. Foster indicted for subversive activity under the Smith Act. Due to his health, he doesn't stand trial. Supreme Court upholds conviction of CP leaders in United States versus Dennis. Foster goes underground. 1957, Foster retires from party activity. And in 1961, dies September 1st in Moscow. Let us now turn to an analysis of the basic concepts animating this collection of writings. Throughout the many decades within which these writings were produced, there are a set of recurrent ideas that reappear in Foster's writings about unionism that get developed on the terrain of the movement of the class struggle. Our purpose here in this section will be to draw together into a systematic whole the various concepts that Foster develops out of the concrete practice of labor organizing. These concepts form the theoretical basis of an explanative and critical intervention in the debates and struggles of this period. Of course, Foster does not create these concepts by himself alone, but he is one of the main developers of the theory of industrial unionism and is one of the leading critics of the labor theory and practice of the American Federation of Labor throughout the first half of the 20th century. Through these critiques, there emerges the basis of an industrial approach that will eventually come to define the basis of the labor movement by mid-century. The principles, strategy, and tactics that Foster outlines here have once again become as relevant as ever, given the decades-long decline of union density since the 1980s that has resulted in a relatively weak and disunited labor movement. With obscene wealth and income inequality surpassing that of the 1920s, and with the power of the employers as strong as ever, the need for these concepts of organizational unity and militant practice are now in dire need of a far-reaching renaissance if organized labor is to bring about the kind of coordinated fight back needed to check the rapacious forces of capital. In this section, we will thus begin with Foster's critiques of the main trends within the labor movement at the time: syndicalism, dual unionism, craft unionism, class collaborationism. We will then turn to the principles and concepts needed to combat them: industrial unionism, federation and amalgamation, militant minority, organizing the unorganized, independent political party of labor, democratization, internationalism. Syndicalism. American syndicalism, most prominent in the early 20th century, follows from the dogmatic principle according to which the economic struggle is everything and the political struggle accounts for very little. In other terminology, it is economism, the belief that the structures of society can be reduced to its economic elements, and that participation in the political struggle only takes away from what is considered the wellspring of revolution. The IWW and the short-lived Syndicalist League of North America exemplify this tendency. Foster's radical formation begins with an embrace of syndicalism and its participation in the IWW. The political tendency most closely associated with syndicalism is anarchism, which opposes direct involvement in the political institutions of society such as they are. As Foster understood it, the specifically American conditions of syndicalism had to do with the generally more favorable economic conditions compared to those of the Europeans during the beginning of the 20th century. The formation of large union bureaucracies and the passage of many workers into a labor aristocracy. Then there were the different political conditions, which, unlike in parts of Europe, granted the at least white and male workers a higher degree of political autonomy, and thus the acuity of political questions and the corresponding need for a mass political party was not as strong. Then there was the heterogeneous nature of American society, which bred many forms of racism and exclusion, making political solidarity difficult. Quote, persistent and widespread syndicalist tendency had its roots in basic American conditions, and a whole series of economic, political, and social factors operating over a long period, European syndicalist influences being only a minor cause of it. These many American factors, by hindering the growth of class consciousness and checking the development of independent working class political organization activity, tended to restrict the struggle of the workers to the economic field, and thereby to create the objective conditions favorable to the development of syndicalism, unquote. In a 1936 essay, Foster sums up the main theoretical errors of syndicalism as follows. One, a great underestimation of the role of the party, especially by De Leon, which led straight to a repudiation of the party altogether by Haywood and other true syndicalists. Two, exaggeration of the role of labor unions and syndicalist speculations of bringing about the revolution by utopian dual industrial unions. Three, misconceptions of the role of the state, especially the dictatorship of the proletariat, and also the elaboration of syndicalist notions of conducting the future socialist society through a trade union state. Dual unionism and independent unionism. Dual unionism is the guiding principle of syndicalism or anarcho-syndicalism. Dual unionism comprises the theory and practice of establishing an alternative labor movement in opposition to the established union order represented in the United States by the American Federation of Labor. Just as syndicalists deny the utility or strategic need to engage in the political sphere, the principle of dual unionism denies the strategy of boring from within, that is, of developing a militant minority of labor leaders that seek to take over control of the established unions from the corrupt and conservative union leadership. While the dual unionism of the IWW supported the policy of industrial unionism, that is, of industry-wide unions comprising adjacent groups of workers involved in the total production process within an industry, the IWW believed that they could develop their one big union by opposing the traditional unions where the vast majority of workers were concentrated. So in Foster's 1922 essay on dual unionism, he seeks to counter some of the accepted ideas at the time concerning why the American labor movement had not developed as strongly as it had in Europe. The first generally accepted idea is that the presence of so many immigrant groups of peoples from so many different nationalities hinders the unity and progress of the movement. But Foster shows that this has proved empirically false in the case of many of the great strikes conducted, where the leading elements have come from the foreign-born. Rather, he suggests that the lack of unity comes from the native-born, homogeneous white Americans who resist the intermixing of peoples. Secondly, there is the accepted notion that the conditions of early 20th century America are considerably better than those in Europe and elsewhere at the time, and thus being relatively more advanced, there is not the impetus to fight to such a degree as pertains in other countries. Yet this too, Foster argues, is not the case, and points to examples showing how hard times do not necessarily lead to a greater upsurge of militancy compared to good times, and that often the opposite is the case. Foster argues that these two widely accepted ideas are not at the root of the troubles and stunted growth of the labor movement. The cause, he claims, is to be found elsewhere. It is to be found in the position of dual unionism, quote, which has been practiced religiously for a generation by American radicals and progressives generally. Because of this policy, thousands of the very best militants have been led to desert the mass of labor organizations and to waste their time in vain efforts to construct ideally conceived unions designed to replace the old ones, unquote. The idea here is that in any union, a militant minority is the driving force behind its activity. Without this militant minority, the great mass of the membership are generally inactive and thus without leadership. Dire consequences flow from this cleavage between the militant minority and the masses of the workers belonging to the AFL unions. One of the main disastrous effects on the trade unions is the draining away of the militant minority, the effect of which is not just leaderless stagnation, but the falling into the maw of the reactionary bureaucratic elements that exist within the union, against which all resistance is taken away. The inactive masses of the unions fall under the leadership of reactive forces, which do all they can to stunt the progress of the unions. Quote, this militant minority is of supreme importance to every branch of the labor movement. It is the thinking and acting part of the working class, the very soul of labor. It works out the fighting programs and takes the lead in putting them into action. It is the source of all real progress, intellectual, spiritual, organizational, in the workers' ranks, unquote. Foster will thus claim by 1922 that, quote, the IWW is a monument to the folly of dual unionism, unquote. So much effort was expended without building anything lasting. IWW membership after 20 years of its existence, much less than at its inception. One Big Union of Canada is another example of this, quote, folly. The Western Federation of Miners proves another example of this tendency of dual unionism to wreck the further strengthening of the labor movement. The IWW came and absorbed all the most militant workers. The IWW militants then turned the knife on the WFM, eventually destroying it from within. So in essence, dual unionism, quote, dual unionism is a useless and insupportable squandering of labor's most precious life force. It is a bottomless pit into which the workers have vainly thrown their energy and idealism, end quote. And again, quote, dual unionism dried up the very spring of progress in the trade unions. It condemned them to sterility and stagnation. It was a long continued process of slow poisoning of the labor movement. If the American labor movement is now hard and fast in the grip of a stupid and corrupt bureaucracy, totally incapable of progress, dual unionism, through its demoralization of the trade union opposition, is chiefly to blame, end quote. So Foster thus identifies the cause of the weakness of the labor movement as having to do with a dogmatic, idealist insistence on a new one big union that would replace the established, often corrupt and reactionary unions. But of course, we can easily see that there would not have been such a dual unionist tendency had the AFL unions been less corrupt and despotic at this time. So dual unionism at base is a reaction to the reactionary elements in American labor. It is the utopian and unscientific response to the stagnation and corruption of the misleaders of labor. We can thus say that dual unionism is a symptom of a deeper cause that impeded the full revolutionary development of the working class in the early decades of the 20th century America. The dual unionism of the IWW is thus an understandable response to what seemed an irresolvable situation within the labor movement at the time, despite the general lack of success of the practical application of dual unionist theory. Quote, despite its long continued lack of success, the dual union theory, however, still continued to exert a hypnotic effect over almost the whole American left wing. The IWW, fanatically dualist, would not even discuss the question of working within the trade unions, nor would the SLP, nor what remained of the left wing in the Socialist Party after the 1919 split. The nascent communist movement, just born out of the SP and the shape of two communist parties, was similarly dualist and endorsed the IWW. Even liberals and progressives in the trade unions and outside were also dead sure that nothing could be done in the old trade unions, unquote. The Trade Union Educational League, co-founded by Foster, is created at a time when the dual unionist tendency was still very strong. At its basis, TUL can be seen as a response to and a rejection of dual unionism. The Trade Union Educational League was set up to counteract dual unionism. Quote, keep the militants in the organized mass is the slogan of the new revolutionary movement, unquote. For, quote, experience teaches us that dual unionism means sectarianism, isolation from the broad labor movement, and eventually disintegration, unquote. In 1929, when TUL is reorganized and renamed the Trade Union Unity League, TUL pursues independent unionism, but still opposes dual unionism. Quote, it declared against a policy of individual withdrawals or petty splits from the AFL, and it proposed to form new unions only where the AFL unions were decrepit or non-existent, unquote. So, independent unionism. Independent unionism is distinct from dual unionism, though it has historically tended to merge with it. Independent unionism seeks to establish independent unions, though not on the basis of opposition and competition with the established unions. Independent unionism was supported by Foster and the CP-affiliated labor organizations in those instances where the established unions were exceedingly decrepit or non-existent. So independent unionism, that is the setting up of new unions only where the AFL unions are decrepit or non-existent, is thus not the same as dual unionism, to repeat. In our contemporary scene, the creation of the independent Amazon labor union and the Starbucks Workers United does not represent a dual unionist tendency, inasmuch as these independent unions do not oppose themselves to the established labor movement and were created precisely where established unions had been non-existent. At the end of the 1920s, with the AFL in severe decline, TUL helped set up independent unions in mining, textile, and needle trades. These independent unions were affiliated wherever possible with the AFL unions. Affiliation with the AFL in this period brings certain problems, given the reactionary nature of its leadership, but there are also advantages to being connected to the main trade unions, not least of which is that it gives the newly organized workers a sense of connection to the larger whole of organized labor, and with it a sense of staying power, which often is not the case with newly formed independent unions. In industries where there are no AFL unions, new unions need to be built and brought into association with the AFL. Those IWW unions that function more or less effectively independently of the AFL, Foster says, should be supported. In those areas where the existing AFL unions are exceptionally weak, corrupt, or moribund, forming an independent union will be necessary. Yet, quote, wherever we form such new unions, whether because there are no AFL unions in the field or because those that may exist are absolutely decrepit, we must from the outset follow a program for the affiliation of these unions to the AFL. We must be keenly on our guard not to get into a dual union position by declaring against the AFL in principle or by permitting an open warfare to develop against it, unquote. The Trade Union Unity League, due to intense opposition from the AFL leadership and the overall corruption of the AFL, will eventually start moving from a principle of independent unionism to dual unionism, which Foster claims is the reason for its eventual demise. In 1934, TUL reaches the peak of its membership with approximately 150,000 members. Despite this numerical weakness, the influence of TUL extended well beyond its numbers. Although it was one of the main powerful blocks of resistance in this period, TUL developed, however, a number of weaknesses which eventually led to its dissolution. Quote, the first was a tendency, under the fierce attacks from its many enemies, to develop its union programs upon a too advanced militant basis and to identify the organizations too closely with the Communist Party. This, of course, had the effect of checking the growth of the organization by making difficult its contacts with the more conservative workers and by narrowing down the TUL united front with the progressives, unquote. Another weakness was the eventual development of dual unionism caused by the deplorable state of the AFL at the time and a sense that it was on its way to collapse. The original policy adopted by TUL in 1929 to continue to work within the established unions and seek affiliation of independent unions with the AFL fell apart. However, quote, the life of the TUL showed that its policy of independent unionism was basically correct and historically justified under the given conditions. This is true in spite of the incorrect tendency already indicated to distort in some cases that policy in the direction of dual unionism, unquote. In Foster's 1936 essay on independent unionism, he further analyzes the conditions that brought about the movement toward independent unionism adopted by labor militants opposed to dual unionism. The first trend has to do with the breaking of a number of important strikes that weakened the strength and strategic position of the AFL, which resulted in a loss of many unskilled workers and the buildup of union control by the skilled labor aristocracy. This result is linked to a second trend toward independent unionism, which has to do with the class collaborationist policies of AFL up into the 1930s, where no strike policies, speed up, and petty bourgeois bureaucratic sclerosis led to an overall weakening of the unions and an inability and unwillingness to organize the unorganized. The third trend had to do with the expulsions of left-wing revolutionaries from the unions and the overall gangsterism and lack of democracy that the unions had degenerated to. Another trend involved the hostility of the AFL union leaders to the upsurge of strikes taking place in the late 1920s, which were sabotaged by these leaders. Quote, all these factors combined showed a definite decline of the AFL unions in strength and fighting ability. Their heavy loss of members and spirit-killing class collaboration, the mass expulsions, and the growing urge for organization among the unorganized all worked together to prepare the ground for independent unionism. So let us now turn to the official policy and labor strategy of the leaders of the American Federation of Labor throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, most notably AFL presidents Samuel Gompers and William Green, who successively led the AFL from 1886 to 1952, and who are the main theoretical targets and exemplars of the craft union labor policy and class collaborationism Foster critiques throughout his writings. Craft unionism is the policy upheld by the AFL from its inception through the subsequent half-century of its existence. Craft unionism is the policy of a union organization on the basis of the smaller component trades within an industry. Unlike industrial unionism, which organizes all workers engaged in different sectors of work in an industry on the basis of a single industry-wide union, craft unions uphold the principle of fostering separate unions within an industry based on the craft or specific kind of work involved. Throughout his writings, Foster denounces craft unionism as a failed model of organizing that impedes the development of the labor movement by consolidating reactionary and undemocratic leadership. So Foster, writing on the differences between the AFL craft unions and the CIO industrial unions in a 1937 essay, writes, quote, "Behind the basic organizational differences between the AFL and CIO unions stand two fundamentally divergent conceptions of unionism. On the one hand, the AFL craft unionism characteristically does not consider or organize the workers as a class or recognize the existence of the class struggle. Instead, it caters principally to the more skilled elements, and it does not hesitate to sacrifice the welfare of the broad masses of the semi-skilled and unskilled in order to further the interests of the skilled workers. Upon this general outlook is based the whole policy of the AFL, its wheedling attitude toward the employers, its subservient policy of class collaboration, its failure to organize the unorganized, its craft scabaree during strikes, its tailing after the capitalist political parties and begging them for minor concessions, etc. We see the general results of such a narrow craft policy in the AFL's repeated loss of strikes, its inability to organize the mass production industries, the insignificant percentage of workers, even of the skilled, that it has organized, and the weak position politically of workers in American life," unquote. So we find in this passage the essential critique that Foster rages time and again against the Gompers and Greens and other misleaders of labor. Craft unionism, although it formed the basis for the first unions that came into existence in the 19th century, had become already in the 19th and even more so in the 20th century, when mass production was much greater developed, an impediment to the further organization of the masses and the formation of class consciousness. The widespread inability or unwillingness to organize the unorganized, a failed strike strategy and adoption of no strike promises to the employers, and its overall petty bourgeois collaboration with the agents of capital rendered the craft union leadership into a reactive force, often at direct odds with the democratic will of the rank and file. The craft union leaders established fiefdoms that they fought tooth and nail to hold on to, which the new industrial unions threatened to break up. The AFL craft unions set out from an anti-democratic principle, using various methods to enforce the views and policies of the leaders at the top, thereby entrenching an unaccountable union bureaucracy that only served to dampen and reduce the effectiveness of the whole labor movement. Some of the chief causes of the weaknesses and unprogressiveness of the AFL craft unions thus had to do with the schemes the corrupt union bureaucracies employed to maintain power, such as narrowing conventions to largely paid officials, packing conventions and making them expensive to attend, arbitrarily suppressing conventions, appointment of all convention committees by the union president, stalling the conventions and then rushing important business through at the very end, parliamentary tricks to stall discussion and thwart legislative process. The AFL craft unions also completely overlooked the worker education and were unable to articulate what the problems the workers faced had to do with the contradictions of capitalism. Another huge problem with the AFL craft unions was their exclusion or uninterest in women, Black workers, communists, etc. This exclusion reflects the same policy of the employers in pitting different groups against each other. In sum, craft unionism, in Foster's eyes, is not simply a union strategy, but a specific historical material force that in its manifestation as the leading policy of the AFL during this period brought with it a whole host of tendencies and complex social, economic, and political relations. One could argue that craft unionism in itself need not be a reactive force or necessarily an impediment to furthering the labor movement. Yet in the hands of corrupt, power-hungry class collaborationists, it was the vehicle of choice for solidifying these underlying tendencies, which the progressive aims of industrial unionism threatened. Craft unionism, as a more fragmentary and disunited structure of labor, was that favored by both the employer and those misleaders of labor who purposely attempted to suppress working class democracy and class consciousness. Foster analyzes a number of the class collaborationist tendencies pushed by Gompers, Green, and the other AFL craft union bureaucrats. So, class collaborationism. Class collaborationism is that which underlies the policy of craft unionism. As an orientation of labor, class collaborationism is the project of the skilled petty bourgeois labor aristocracy, the, quote, misleaders of labor, who stand opposed to genuine working class democracy and class consciousness. Class collaboration is expressed by the various ideas and practices that reject class struggle and attempt to harmonize labor and capital. Such harmonization means, in practice, the further subjugation of the mass of labor to capital and the solidification of a labor aristocracy. So, examples of class collaboration. Business unionism, wherein the workers are encouraged to become stockholders in the company, is one such form of class collaboration. The ideology of business unionism is that of erasing the difference between the capitalist and laborer. The worker stockholder in reality will only ever own a very small amount of the total stock holdings. Business unionism is also that which promotes the speed up policies and rationalization of production, which, far from advancing working people's position, only makes the class division stronger. Quote, everywhere the union leaders, cooperating with the employers, are driving the workers faster in production, weakening their organization, and generally laying the basis for eventual broad class upheavals, end quote. The union leaders promote the ideology of the worker capitalist through the promotion of labor banking, investment corporations, stock ownership, trade union insurance companies, etc. These all comprise class collaboration, that is, the turning away from a militant working class outlook, and which eventually turns the workers against the unions. There is a lowering of morale and sowing of indifference produced through class collaboration. Foster speaks of the, quote, declining role of the unions under the new orientation as fighting organizations. The leaders do nothing to stir the militant spirit and class enthusiasm of the workers. They fail to lead the unions in defense of the workers' interests. They resist every effort to develop the unions into organizations capable of coping with modern capitalism. They rigidly suppress all union democracy and poison the very class soul of the unions with capitalist economics. The widespread indifference of the workers towards the unions is an inevitable result of the prevailing intense class collaboration policies of the union officialdom, end quote. Accompanying the class collaborationism of the craft union bureaucrats is an irreducible tendency toward autocratic control and corruption. Union leaders confining the unions to skilled workers is one form of betrayal of working class unity and democracy. Discriminating against Blacks, women, and youth is another. Refusing to amalgamate unions for fear of losing their positions is yet another form of betrayal of working class interests. Union scabbery, where leaders keep one or more unions in industry at work while others are on strike, is yet another form of betrayal. And of course, union spying on the workers for the sake of the employers is a clear act of betrayal of what unions are supposed to be. There is thus in capitalist countries a constant tendency toward the establishment of a labor aristocracy, a segment of the working class that advances itself toward a comfortable middle class position, becoming the petty bourgeois accomplices of the owning class. Such a tendency is naturally present in the union officialdom. Quote, the labor official of today, with his private fortune, fancy automobiles, aristocratic apartments, and extensive business interests, is a very different type from the men who laid the basis of our trade union movement, unquote. these labor leaders, quote, reject a policy of militant struggle against the employers because all their group interests lead them to develop friendly relations in collaboration with the exploiters of the workers. Between the interests of the mass of American organized labor and those of their leaders, a vast chasm yawns. One of the principal ways of shutting out rank and file is through making union conventions almost entirely the affair of the union bureaucrats. Then there's, of course, red baiting, which consists in terrifying the ideologically uncertain or backward parts of union membership with accounts of incredible duplicity, espionage, and evil plotting on the part of communists in league with Soviet Russia. Quote, practically all trade union journals and conventions, from the AFL down, now have as regular features such slanders. The reactionaries first picture a terrible red menace and then, identifying all progressive proposals with it, scare away the more timid delegates. They make, in the minds of many, such elementary issues as amalgamation of the Labor Party and the organization of the unorganized synonymous with Bolshevism, unquote. Then there is armed force, hired thuggery, which the corrupt union leaders employ to keep the rank and file in line. It should be said that at this time in the 1920s, the Socialist Party and the Second International groupings completely embraced these class collaborationist policies practiced by the AFL. Yet of all these betrayals, Foster writes in 1929 that the worst betrayal was that done against the Black workers of America. Of all the shameful treason to the working class committed by the misleaders who held the old trade unions, none has been more disastrous than their systematic betrayal of the Negro workers, unquote. The AFL unions betrayed the Black workers and in so doing committed labor treason against those workers and against the working class as a whole, inasmuch as racial divisions are the tools the employer utilizes to fragment and weaken the labor movement. Quote, all this constitutes one of the most shameful pages in American labor history. The 1929 Trade Union Educational League Convention took opposition to this policy of the misleaders of labor as highest priority. Quote, it is the special task of the tool to organize Black workers as part of its general work of organizing the unorganized. This can only be done in the face of studied opposition of the AFL leaders working hand in glove with the employers. Quote, white chauvinism among workers and the union leaders had led to a treacherous disregard of the revolutionary potential of the Black working masses, inasmuch as these workers, quote, have a double oppression as workers and as Negroes to fill them with fighting spirit and resentment against capitalism. It has been one of the most serious errors of the left wing to underestimate and to neglect the development of this great proletarian fighting force, unquote. All of these class collaborationist policies pushed by the AFL over a period of decades comprised what the corrupt union leaders and the employers glowingly referred to as the rationalization of labor. Yet it was precisely this supposed rationalization that helped produce one of the most severe economic crashes in history. The class collaborationist labor rationalization policies pushed by the employers during the 1920s and upheld by the misleaders of labor helped produce the international crash of 1929. Overproduction and lagging purchasing power contributed directly to the crisis. Quote, the whole rationalization business was a classical example of the suicide economics of capitalism, unquote. One of the other effects of rationalization was a historic demoralization of the labor movement, wherein, quote, confused by the bourgeoisification of their upper ranks of skilled workers, the proletariat lost much of their fighting spirit. Never in the history of the labor movement were strikes so few and trade union morale so low, unquote. This period of prosperity prior to the crash failed to bring in more workers to the labor movement. On the contrary, the unions lost members due to the various anti-worker policies of class collaboration. As a result, by the end of the 1920s, the Socialist Party had nearly ceased to exist. The Farmer Labor Party movement had completely dwindled, and the IWW and other independent unions declined heavily. Quote, the Coolidge era was the period of the deepest confusion and demoralization in the history of the working class, unquote. One of the effects of the great industrial crash of 1929 was the complete shattering of the illusions and policy put forward by the misleaders of labor. The labor movement was completely fractured and in disarray as the misleaders of labor retreated. During the first few years of the crisis before Roosevelt's New Deal, the misleaders continued their collaboration with the employers to make the workers' condition even worse, further isolating themselves from the working masses. The AFL, delegitimized in the eyes of the workers, doubled down on collaboration, signing on to Hoover's commandment for a no-strike policy. After wage cuts were applied to the unorganized workers, the misleaders then assisted the employers with pushing wage cuts in organized labor. Only Toole resisted, but was relatively weak and unable to counter these cuts. The mass of organized workers were demoralized and unable to resist enforced poverty. Shamefully, the AFL joined with Wall Street interests in denouncing unemployment insurance as subsidized idleness. By contrast, communists were, quote, persistently fighting for it all over the country, unquote. The Trade Union Unity League and the CP undertook some of the most significant resistance to these capitalist offensives of enforced immiseration and poverty. Central to the fight back were the organization of strikes and a campaign for unemployment insurance. Quote, it is an incontestable fact that during the crisis up to the New Deal period, the only serious resistance made by the workers and other toilers against the monstrous mass pauperization was that organized and led by the Communist Party and the Trade Union Unity League. Toole and the CP militants and the masses they rallied were viciously attacked by the combined weight of the government and the employers. Hundreds were beaten up, jailed, or deported. Many were killed. American capitalism experienced its greatest strains and threats of self-destruction after the 1929 collapse and the subsequent Hoover policy of giving even more to financial capital while letting the workers starve. The proponents of the capitalist system realized that something drastically needed to be done to save the system. Quote, new measures must be taken, and that swiftly. The something that finance capital decided upon to save their capitalist system was contained in Roosevelt's New Deal, unquote. The New Deal expressed a much increased centralization of the federal government and intensified intervention in economic life. Quote, by its heavy government spending and minor sops to the masses, the New Deal in substance was a shot in the arm, a doping of the economic system out of its deepening crisis. It was calculated to preserve the capitalist system by relieving somewhat the economic and mass pressure. The center of it, the National Recovery Act, was contrived in Wall Street and was first enunciated by the US Chamber of Commerce. Many capitalist theoreticians hailed it as the beginning of fascism. To call the New Deal socialistic or communistic is nonsense. It had nothing in common with either, unquote. One of the effects of the New Deal, however, was the sudden and unexpected outpouring of working class militancy in face of the many years of suffering imposed by the government and the employers. 1933 to 35 saw a great upsurge of strike action and organizing. This upsurge of militancy would lead the capitalists who initially favored the New Deal to turn against it. The workers as well began to understand the New Deal was not set up primarily to grant them relief, but to do the absolute minimum needed to support the workers while the capitalist system recovered. The strikes that took place in this period were also ruthlessly attacked with organized violence of the government and employers. The Trade Union Unity League and the Communist Party were behind many of the largest strikes that took place between 1933 and 1936. So we have now sketched the basic outlines of Foster's analysis of craft unionism and the related phenomena of class collaborationism. It remains to us now to delve deeper into that which throughout his life he fought for as the antithetical, dialectically opposing element that sought to overturn craft unionism and its class collaborationism, that is, industrial unionism and its related phenomena of working class democracy, political independence, and internationalism. Industrial unionism. Industrial unionism is the dynamic process of amalgamation of distinct unions and federation of unions across industries. It is the force of organic synthesis expressed by the bodies of organized labor. As a regulative concept, it is the idea of total unity of the distinct parts of the whole of labor into a single class consciousness and collective will. In practice, it is the complexification of the isolated parts of labor into an integrated democratic totality. In his Industrial Unionism essay from 1922, Foster sketches how craft unions must federate to withstand the attacks from the bosses. These federated craft unions then should amalgamate into industrial unions, which then seek a higher level of unity between themselves, federating with each other and amalgamating into a greater united force. There is a logic of development based on survival and evolution from simple and isolated elements into more complex, unified ones. The development of unions is based not on certain shared ideas, but on the struggle for survival and material welfare. The dual unionists do not understand this, believing that they can organize new unions on the basis of better or purer ideas. Quote, the workers organize in the industrial field not because they hold certain elaborate social beliefs jointly, but because through united action, they can protect their common economic interests. Labor unions are built upon the solid rock of the material welfare of the workers, not upon their acceptance of stated political opinions, unquote. The Trade Union Educational League was set up to counteract this tendency of dual unionism. The militants and the organized mass is the slogan of the new revolutionary movement, says Foster. Keeping the militants in the organized masses is still on the agenda when in 1936 Foster writes about the formation of the Committee for Industrial Organization, later the Congress of Industrial Organizations, within the left wing of the AFL. In the years following the First World War, when the profit-loaded corporations began an offensive against the trade unions, the first calls for industrial unionism began. The AFL annual convention in 1919 revealed the outlines of a struggle of the craft union leaders against the militant revolutionary wing that was calling for industrial unionism. The 1919 strike wave was defeated primarily because of the weakness of craft unionism. The Communist Party and the Trade Union Educational League made industrial unionism a central concern at this point, which they would fight for throughout the 1920s. Between the beginning and end of the 1920s, AFL membership declined by half due to craft union infighting, no strike policy, and the general class collaboration of union leadership with the employers. When the Trade Union Unity League eventually disbanded in the early 1930s, those militants entered into the AFL unions and became the most militant tendency in the AFL. At the time of Foster's writing here, 1936, the fight for industrial unionism had reached its highest point. The 1933-34 strike movement saw the militants within the AFL creating new locals and organizing strikes, often against the desires of the union leadership. During the New Deal era, the number of company unions greatly expanded in those industries the AFL had ignored, against which the craft unions were unable to fight. The industrial United Mine Workers, by contrast, were able to organize 500,000 miners in this period. Fascist organizations also began to make their appearance in America, which in Europe had already set about smashing the unions. Industrial unionism began to be seen by the workers as a necessary formation of resistance against the destructive logic of fascism. Even still, the misleaders of labor within the AFL continued to resist the call for industrial unionism, which the 1934 AFL convention gave even greater voice to, but which the craft union leaders behind the scenes did all they could to subvert. By the 1935 convention, a minority movement emerged of labor leaders calling for the official adoption of industrial unionism within the AFL. The resolution for the adoption of industrial unionism was defeated in the craft-dominated AFL convention by a vote of about 18,000 to 11,000. On the heels of the convention, the minority labor leaders in the AFL in favor of industrial organization formed a Committee for Industrial Organization. The Executive Council of the AFL subsequently orders the dissolution of this committee. Quote, yes, these so-called labor leaders would split the AFL rather than adopt forms and methods which would unify the working class by enabling the AFL to organize the big majority of the unorganized, unquote. Foster claims, however, that the John Lewis-led CIO movement stopped short of seeing the full problem, which is not just that of building industrial unionism in the mass production industries, but of building it in all industries, and just as importantly, doing away once and for all with the gangsterism and anti-democratic structure of the AFL. So industrial unionism takes as its guiding democratic principle the policy of democratic centralism and is itself inseparable from processes of democratization and inclusion of the multiplicity of identities of the workers. The fight for industrial unionism thus cannot be detached from a fight for workplace democracy, that is to say, socialism as the democratic involvement of the totality of workers in the conditions of production. The problem is that Lewis himself and the others within the Committee for Industrial Organization practiced the same anti-democratic tactics against communists and other militants within the unions, which the Executive Council of the AFL was practicing against the newly formed CIO. Quote, by failing to see that the fight for industrial unionism is closely connected with the need of a class struggle policy, the CIO greatly weakens the struggle for industrial unionism, unquote. In his 1937 essay, The Renaissance of the American Labor Movement, Foster concludes, quote, the American trade union movement is at a turning point. It is breaking with its old conservative past and is crossing the threshold of a new era of progress, unquote. The CIO hearkens this progress. At the time of 1937, it was composed of 15 industrial unions with some 2 million total members. Despite being repressed by the leaders of the AFL, the CIO took on the work it prescribed as necessary, all while maintaining regular affiliation with the AFL. The CIO won 2 major strikes at automobile plants and expanded the Auto Workers Union overnight to 300,000 members. The CIO also forced the United States Steel Corporation to recognize the CIO Steelworkers Union, which expanded greatly in a short period of time. Quote, in the many CIO organization campaigns and strikes, the communists are playing an important role, cooperating freely with the CIO. Especially is this true of the auto and steel industries, unquote. Despite these successes, or rather because of them, the reactionary class collaborationist leadership of the AFL suspended CIO unions from AFL affiliation and denied them the right to vote at the 1936 AFL convention. The Communist Party led the charge against this assault and splitting of the labor movement, outlining a policy for reuniting the warring groups under the banner of the AFL. Nevertheless, the reactionaries under President Greene continued to oppose and subvert the CIO. At the time of Foster's writing, quote, the CIO and the AFL now practically constitute 2 distinct national trade union centers. The split, although steadily deepening, is however not fully completed, unquote. The AFL and CIO had at this time about the same number of members, around 2 million each, though the CIO was expanding at a faster rate because of its drive to organize the unorganized. The CIO also already had greater concentration in the heavy, strategically more important industries due to its specific drive to organize those industries and bring in many of the semi-skilled and unskilled workers the AFL had ignored. And the CIO, despite some of the critiques Foster levels at its leadership, was far more in line with a progressive and democratic direction than was the AFL. Quote, thus the CIO is superior to the AFL numerically. in strategical position, and in general political tendency. Quote. This split between the AFL and CIO Foster sees as needing to be remedied immediately, for it serves the ends of the employer to have labor disunited in such a way. To remedy this split, Foster counsels the furthering of the work of the CIO, particularly the organizing of the unorganized, as well as CIO calling a national union convention in which the AFL-CIO and the independent unions would come together. The AFL reactionaries would resist such a convention, but Foster sees that, quote, the handwriting is on the wall for them and their reactionary regime. The American labor movement is going to experience a New Deal of its own, unquote. The theoretical and practical advantages of the CIO Foster sees as creating the conditions for an inevitable merging of the AFL and CIO. Quote, around the CIO are grouping the major mass forces that should, with effective leadership, eventually crystallize into a great American People's Front, unquote. We, of course, know the AFL and CIO did eventually merge in 1955. But by that time, the political winds took a turn that Foster could not fully see at the time of this writing, which would be the post-war anti-communist reaction that led to the expulsion of communists and other progressives from the AFL-CIO and the jailing and forcing underground of Communist Party leaders. In the late 1930s, however, Foster holds out the hope of a merging of the labor movement and the creation of an independent party of labor capable of defeating the united forces of capital. So in his 1937 Organizational Problems of Industrial Unionism, Foster sets out the organizational tasks needed to bring about the synthetic unity of labor in ever-expanding industrial unions. A union is primarily a fighting organization that, though it signed legally binding agreements with the capitalist employers, only exists and expands on the basis of strength, that is, fighting power. The basic improvement of industrial unions over craft unions is that they are more effective vehicles of struggle against capitalist exploitation. The new industrial unions of the CIO are more concentrated units of strength compared to the craft AFL unions. They are also a more effective bearer of worker democracy compared to the top-down bureaucracy of the craft unions. Most essentially, the CIO industrial unions begin from the principle of the class struggle, which many of the AFL craft unions had no real understanding of and consequently failed to unite skilled and unskilled laborers and to organize the unorganized. To build up the proper fighting power for a union to advance and win battles in the class war, there needs to be discipline, but this discipline cannot be imposed from above. There needs to be engendered self-discipline, and the only way in which the workers themselves come to impose upon themselves such discipline is through union democracy, wherein the workers feel that each has a say and hence a tangible stake in the advancement of union activity. The AFL craft unions set out from an anti-democratic principle, using various methods to enforce the views and policies of the leaders at the top, thereby entrenching an unaccountable union bureaucracy that only serves to dampen and reduce the effectiveness of the whole labor movement. The correct policy of union democracy is that of democratic centralism. A thorough debate of the issues at hand, followed by evincing the majority consensus on the plan of action, followed up with a firm enforcement of the will of the majority. So in addition to amalgamation, federation, and democratization, organizing the unorganized, increasing the numbers of the masses, and organized labor is the accompanying dynamic that flows from industrial unionism. Unifying existing labor and expanding its reach in democratic movement are principal dynamics that express industrial unionism. So yes, closely related to the process of amalgamation, federation, and democratization is organization of the unorganized. Amalgamation and federation are thus both what solidify and strengthen the existing labor movement and would expand it to include a greater number of the working class. For at this period, as today, union density was low compared to the total number of workers in the country. Foster recognizes that the only way for labor to combat the combined forces of monopoly capitalism was to enlarge organized labor to a force strong enough to effectively combat unified capital. Quote, amalgamation and an organization drive, he writes in 1923. That is the slogan that fits our present needs. The whole labor movement should proceed on that basis. On the one hand, to reorganize the craft unions into industrial organizations, and on the other, to sweep the masses into the reorganized unions, unquote. In his Question of the Unorganized from 1925, Foster writes, quote, the question of organizing the many millions of unorganized workers is the most vital matter now before the American labor movement. The future progress of the working class depends upon the solution of this great problem, unquote. Organizing the unorganized isn't just about extending the rights and protections of organized labor to the millions who do not have it, but also of strengthening the existing unions heavily under attack by the employers. Large sections of unorganized workers in an industry provide a means for the employers to weaken the areas where labor has been united, shifting operations and playing workers against each other to the detriment of all labor. But bringing in unorganized workers into the unions is not simply a matter of expanding the number of union members. Rather, it is a question of developing the organizational composition of the unions, broadening their bases to include more of the workers in key industries, the semi-skilled or unskilled laborers who comprise the majority of American labor, of which there are large numbers of Black, women, youth, foreign-born, and other types of workers that have traditionally been excluded from the privileges of union membership. It is thus a matter of democratization of the unions, not only to extend its benefits to the excluded groups, but in so doing to strengthen the totality of labor so as to create the conditions for revolutionary changes in the means of production. Democratization of the unions is thus functionally undistinguishable from the development of the economic opposition to capital, that is, class-conscious proletarian seizure of economic power. The unorganized will bring to the existing unions a revolutionary tendency toward amalgamation, seeing as they have nothing to gain from the petty bourgeois tendencies of craft unionism. Foster states that they will be a driving force of federation, amalgamation, and democratization of the existing unions. Not only this, they will push forward the movement for an independent labor party, given the influx of class consciousness into the labor movement and the intensification of the conflict between labor and capital that will result from it. Organizing the unorganized is inseparable from bringing into the labor movement those who have been either excluded from because of their identity or bypassed due to the perceived unskilled nature of their work. But such, quote, unskilled workers are those who are on the front line of the material production of capital, its most exploited and most essential workers. Extending organization into these key industries, which are at this time largely unorganized, means a strategic capture of the most essential points in capital production. The organization of the unorganized will also do much to bolster revolutionary politics. If class-conscious revolutionaries are leading the organization of the unorganized, they will thereby win influence over the masses, show the masses their ability to lead in the correctness of the revolutionary stance, thereby winning the masses over to the side of political revolution, as opposed to capitalist reformism or reaction. This is precisely the course that the Trade Union Educational League and the Communist Party took. It is only the left-wing class-conscious revolutionaries that can, in effect, push the organization of the unorganized forward, for the right reactionaries will always oppose expanding the labor movement, while the centrist moderates and progressives will not take the initiative of their own, though they might later support it. The right-wing forces within the labor movement will always oppose sabotage or unmeaningfully support organization campaigns. These right-wing forces are tied to the privileges they have gleaned from the employer, which they guard from any disturbance of new workers coming into the unions. They thus must be fought against by the revolutionary organizers, for the right wing of the labor movement is in many senses an appendage of the employers used to interfere with and impede successful labor organizing. Only through an overwhelming coming together of left-wing and progressive forces can the right wing be forced into broad organizing campaigns of the unorganized. In general, the right wing's tactics are more those of indirect sabotage than outright opposition. It is precisely the stance that Foster attributes as defining the majority of AFL union leaders. Quote, the right-wing bureaucrats find it exceedingly difficult to fight directly against the demand for organization. Their method is mostly indirect. They commonly adopt organization resolutions presented by the more progressive elements and then sabotage them to death. They do lip service to the organization of the unorganized and then prevent it in practice. The American Federation of Labor has adopted from time to time resolutions for the organization of every industry in the country, and immediately after the conventions has promptly forgotten all of them. Unquote. Despite the backwardness of the AFL leadership, Foster is of course not proposing here the policy of dual unionism. When it comes to organizing the unorganized, these unorganized need to be brought into the general labor movement. Revolutionary organizers will thus either stimulate existing unions into organizing campaigns or form new unions in industries where there are no unions or the existing unions are hopelessly decrepit. Quote, the two evils we have to guard against are, on the one side, the devil of dual unionism, and on the other, the dogma of unity with the old trade unions at any price. Unquote. Both dual unionism and unity at any price tendencies need to be equally guarded against, for the first leads to sectarianism, isolation, and fracturing of the labor movement, while the second brings about a capture of the rank and file by the existing relations within the unions, which will drain the upsurge of organizing activity of its power and militancy. But Foster emphasizes that the greatest danger that the left wing confronts in such situations is the persistent dual tendency to pull away from the old unions and to establish new and independent organizations which isolate our forces from the main body of organized workers, unquote. So depending on the level of organized opposition of the employers, organizing the unorganized will be done either openly or in secret. Open organizing has to do with pushing the existing labor unions into an open campaign of organizing the unorganized, setting up committees between locals of the unions for this purpose, and carrying out a program that takes the fight directly to the employer. Such open organizing is possible where the level of opposition on the part of the employer is relatively weak. However, where conditions exist wherein the employer is highly organized and even willing and able to use violence to resist organization campaigns, labor organizers will need to employ secret or indirect methods. Such methods include working within company unions to eventually destroy and transform them into trade unions. Another method is propagandizing and laying the groundwork for a union campaign within the workers' clubs and fraternal organizations. Another method is that employed by the Communist Party, whose shop branches were, quote, an organizational form of great importance in the organization of the unorganized workers. These branches, distributed widely through the industries and built upon the basis of the respective factories, will prove invaluable contact points for the starting of broad movements, for the launching of strikes and the establishment of trade unions, unquote. All of these methods are employed in the so-called closed industries that are highly resistant to organization. In its organization work, quote, in its organization work, the left wing must aim to work in the open. When this cannot be done, the work must be done underground. The question of determining just how far we can work in the open and how much we will have to use indirect methods will prove one of the most delicate problems we have to solve in our organization campaign, unquote. In organizing the unorganized, many of the workers being brought into the unions do not have an immediate care for the union itself, but only what they can get from the employer through it. In order to keep the allegiance of the workers, therefore, the immediate economic needs, the sources of the workers' deprivations, need to be kept front and center. Quote, the future trade unions of the great unorganized industries will be born in the heat of the struggle against the employers over the demands of the workers. The organization campaign which does not voice the demands of the workers and envisage an early struggle in defense of them is doomed beforehand to failure, unquote. Moreover, these demands must be made as broad as possible, with the aim in view of having them apply to the entire industry. Effective mass propaganda and educational work must be done to achieve the breadth and unity needed to win against the employer. This also involves developing a successful strike strategy, strikes being one of the most powerful conduits of revolutionary activity and working class consciousness building. Quote, successful trade union organizers must be masters of strike strategy. One thing they must know is how to deal a blow at the employers opportunely. The left wing must learn to hit the employers when they are least able to stand it and to deliver the attack with the maximum force. The employers are wide awake to this danger and follow the counter policy of trying to force the workers into premature struggles, unquote. Revolutionary organizers must develop an expert sense of timing. They must know how to propagandize, ply a boycott, engage in mass picketing. They must know how to turn specific class struggles around organizing the unorganized into dramas, wherein the broader working class sees itself reflected. Revolutionary organizers must have in view complete class solidarity and go about organizing on the basis of the revolutionary demands of labor in relation to capital, that is, the subsumption of capital to labor and the total transformation of the social relations within the productive process. Quote, the left wing must take the lead in the organization of the unorganized millions. This is an historical necessity of the situation. We must not falter or fail at our task. It is a time for intelligent, courageous, militant action, unquote. So finally, industrial unionism comprises a strike strategy and tactics that represent a higher stage in working class collective resistance. In addition to amalgamation, federation, democratization, and organizing the unorganized, there is one final aspect that adheres to the essence of industrial unionism as Foster envisioned it. This aspect has to do with the primary tactical weapon that the organized working class possesses, the strike. The history of AFL craft unionism is in no small part the history of ineffective strike tactics and overall strategy, not to mention the outright sabotage of the independent initiative to strike of the rank and file. Against this, Foster puts forward principles for the successful conducting of strikes and outlines how only through industrial unionism can successful strike strategy be developed and a proper tactical use of the strike be employed. We will conclude this section in this presentation with a summation of the strike strategy Foster puts forward in his 1937 steel strike strategy, which is written with a view to an impending strike in the steel industries, but which applies to strike strategy in all industries. General propositions concerning strike strategy. 1. Firm ideological unity. The bosses will always try to split the workers in terms of race, ethnicity, skilled and unskilled, etc. So there needs to be a unifying ideological current strong enough to overcome these divisions. Workers must be made to believe that they all have to gain from the success of the movement. Organizers must, quote, focus the attention of the masses primarily upon the immediate economic and political demands of the steel workers and reject all reactionary efforts to divert the workers' attention into abstract discussion of race, religion, policies, etc. 2, ideological unity can only be achieved and maintained when the morale of the workers can be efficiently maintained. Morale building requires more than just ideological discipline, good organization, and the like, but a certain feeling for the masses, a sense of ebbs and flows, and the capacity to maintain the center of gravity of what is being fought for. 3, the best fighting policy is an offensive one. A defensive strike is a losing strike. Each attack by the employers must be met with a renewed counterattack wherever possible. Quote, every halt must be utilized to organize a new attack, and every attack by the employers or the government must be offset by some form of renewed counteroffensive, unquote. 4, unified command is absolutely necessary. Craft unionism often leads to a splitting of command, the source of many defeats. Quote, the introduction of craft unionism into the mass production industries by the AFL leaders should be resisted militantly by every progressive force in the whole labor movement as a strike-breaking policy. This resistance should be supported by an aggressive campaign to educate the unorganized masses as to the historical failure of craft unionism in the mass production industries, and by a call to these workers not to join the craft unions, but to affiliate themselves with the CIO industrial unions, unquote. 5, leaders cannot be diverted by perceived good feelings on the part of the company or governmental mediation that purports to be on the side of the workers. The main goal of strike strategy is to wrest immediate concessions from the employers. 6, leaders must have a finely attuned sense of the forces necessary to achieve the objective. Quote, a good strategist never sends a boy to do a man's job. And quote, all they will get is what they are willing and able to fight for. 7, striking power is dependent on a proper preliminary organization of forces. A strike can only be successful to the extent that the forces necessary to achieve it have been planned for and prepared. All workers in an industry must be in a union before the strike begins. Mass meetings and distribution of information must bring all the workers into the union, including office workers and other adjacent workers. Company unions must be dissolved into the amalgamated association before the strike begins, because company-controlled unions will be used to break the strike when it does occur. 8, there must be democratic strike leadership of the rank and file, a democratic strike committee system. The workers must believe that the strike is really their affair, and this belief can only be made good on in practice through the active democratic involvement of the workers themselves. Strike committees should be created in each district and factory with adequate representation of Black women and foreign-born. 9, the strike must have mass participation, which means the active involvement of those connected to the workers, friends and family in particular, who provide support. Mass participation also means the deployment of all social and cultural involvement of the workers and their supporters, from marches to the singing of songs to sports activities to social affairs. The most important of all these, however, is the picket, which should be engaged in by all. Joint pickets of simultaneously striking industries should be set up wherever possible, and the unemployed and members of non-striking unions can also lend essential support. Quote, often the difference between bad and good picketing is the difference between a lost and a won strike. Pickets should be organized into squads that each have their captains. Pickets need to be maintained around the clock. 10, the employers will do everything they can to create hysteria and delegitimize the strikers through their publicity channels. This is why the striking workers need to develop an effective publicity counteroffensive. The focus needs to continually be brought back to the immediate economic and political demands of the struggle. Quote, they should relentlessly explore the vast riches and profits of the employers and the health-destroying, spirit-killing poverty of the workers, the terrorization and suppression of civil rights by the boss's gunmen, the great significance to American democracy of the victory of the workers, etc. Unquote. The workers themselves need to be continuously educated as to the meaning of the strike and the necessity of its victory, for they will be barraged constantly by anti-union messaging, attempting to get them to go back to work. Workers need to be constantly informed about the strike progress and its conditions as they evolve, so that the strike itself does not become something separate from them. 11, systems of strike relief need to be set up that provide food and other materials to the striking workers. Committees of relief collection and distribution need to be set up, and networks developed with local organizations for the donation of provisions. Money, shelter, food, clothing, medical aid must be collected and provided to the striking families, workers and their families in all localities where striking is taking place. 12, material and legal defense of civil rights and personal safety of the strikers is also necessary. Attacks must be met with mobilization of the masses and protest, along with coordination of legal defense. Armed defense must be utilized where the personal safety of the strikers and strike leaders are at risk. These 12 principles of strike strategy are those suited to a new era of industrial unionism, an era which we are still living in and fighting for, though in somewhat different terrain. The 4 aspects of industrial unionism we have synthesized from, we have collected from Foster's text: amalgamation and federation, democratization, organizing the unorganized, and strike strategy, despite being written about nearly 100 years ago, still carry force as the ongoing tasks of a labor movement that has seen setbacks and changes, the likes of which Foster in this period could not have foreseen. Yet the soundness of these teachings can only be proved by a revivification of the labor movement through their employment. We can only hope that in these coming years, there will be an expansion of the processes that Foster describes, for we contend that they contain fundamental truths of revolutionary trade unionism, that is, a trade unionism that goes beyond the confines of capitalist consciousness to become the class consciousness of the historical necessity of transcending capitalism through socialism in view of the communist horizon.